Someone has been stalking my 3-year-old daughter. I just found out she's been letting him in to sleep with her. It first started in the Walmart parking lot. The kids had too much energy, so we went for an evening Walmart trip. As we walked back to the car, I noticed one of the streetlights in the far corner, blinking on and off. There's something about blinking street lamps that's inherently creepy. I don't know why. Maybe because we're evolutionarily designed to be afraid of the dark, and blinking streetlights often go out. Or maybe it's because of the stop-motion effect. There's a reason why haunted houses use strobe lights all the time. In any case, I found myself staring at it as we helped the kids in the car, and that's when I noticed something was off. As a car drove by on the main road, the streetlight blinked off, and there was something there that obscured the red taillights for just a split second. It happened so fast I thought I imagined it, especially when the light blinked back on an instant later, and there was clearly nothing standing under it. I didn't think much of it and got into the car. As we pulled out onto the main road, glanced back at it. It was still flickering, and something about it sent a chill up my spine. We pulled out onto the road and the light disappeared from view. The kids went right to bed, and then my husband and I were unwinding in the living room. I was flipping through pages on my Kindle when something caught my eye. The lamppost outside our house was blinking on and off. I walked over to the window. "What's up?" Charles asked behind me, when I'd been standing there a few minutes. "The light's flickering." "So?" "There was a streetlight flickering in the Walmart parking lot too." I turned to him. "Isn't that weird?" "Not really." He went back to his snacks, pushing out the uneasy feeling in my stomach. I started to turn away. "Wait." I turned back. There was a light on in the house across the street, but when the lamppost blinked off, the black edge of the window wasn't quite straight. I squinted at it. There was a bump or a curve, almost like a semicircle, that was poking into the golden square of the illuminated window. Like something was standing there, partially blocking out the window's light. Except nothing was there, because the shape disappeared every time the light blinked back on. "Charles, come back over here." "Do I have to?" "I see something weird, I don't know." I glanced back at him and frowned. He was leaning back in the recliner, feet up, stuffing himself with chips. "Please come over." All right. He heaved himself off the couch and came over. I described the curve to him, the little sliver of silhouette I was seeing. "I don't see it." "You don't see it?" He shook his head. "There's nothing out there, Becca." I squinted again into the darkness. Then I gave up and settled back in with my book. Something woke me in the middle of the night. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard it again, a distinct thump coming from somewhere in the house. "Charles, I heard something," I said, shaking his shoulder. But I didn't wait for him to wake up. I flicked on the hall light and ran to the kids' rooms. My son, thankfully, was sleeping soundly. I leapt from my daughter's room and stopped dead. In the crack under the door, I could see a flickering bluish light. I grabbed the doorknob and burst inside. The night light. It was blinking on and off erratically, casting the entire room in jerky stop-motion flashes. I ran over to the bed. Thank God my daughter was there, sleeping peacefully. I glanced back towards the hall to look for Charles. I froze. There was a dark shape in the corner of the room. I could only see it for a moment. When the night light flickered out, as soon as it came back on, the corner was empty. My heart pounded in my chest. I stared at the corner. Off. The shape was there. On. It wasn't. Off. The shape looked like someone crouched in the corner. On. It looked closer. Off. Oh God. It was closer. On. The intervals were getting longer. I was paralyzed. My breath was stuck in my lungs. Off. Dang. It was halfway across the room. On. The light blinked on, remaining on. That didn't give me comfort. I couldn't see it. It could be anywhere. It could be right in front of my... Off! I screamed. It was right in front of me, filling up my entire vision. I backed away, putting myself squarely between my daughter and me. Click. Yellow light filled the room. "Becca!" Charles stood in the doorway, bleary-eyed. I glanced around wildly, but the room was empty. The nightlight was still off. I leapt forward and pulled it out of its socket. It clattered to the floor. Then I began to sob as I told Charles everything. The next day, the whole thing seemed ridiculous. What? I really saw some figure huddled in our house that disappeared in the light? It made no sense. It was much more likely that I'd seen some sort of sleep paralysis demon, or my half-asleep brain misinterpreted shadows or something. But when I went into my daughter's room later, something caught my eye. 3 coarse, long black hairs laying on the carpet. I then saw my daughter crying on her bed. "Mommy, can the man sleep in bed with me again?" And now, as the sun is setting, and the deep shadows of dusk are filling the house, I'm terrified to turn on any lights. In my city, there is a law to never go outside when it rains. I was nearly murdered when I decided to go against it. I had been here my whole life, so I never thought much of the law. I live on the outskirts of a small town in the heart of the desert. The town center is a haphazard collection of semi-decaying buildings, and my nearest neighbor is over a mile away across the dried and barren landscape. But the isolation suits me. I've lived a comfortable, quiet life here for years, until yesterday. While storms are typical for this time of year as we're halfway through our monsoon season, nothing prepared me for the fury and intensity with which yesterday's thunderstorm would hit. The dark clouds crested the distant mountains late in the afternoon, and within an hour had stampeded across the desert valley and were churning overhead. The wind picked up, hurling sand, dried vegetation, and small rocks across the yard at my house. Then the rain started. Instead of a slow and steady trickle of rain, the clouds seemed to split open and dump all the stored-up rain all at once. The water pounded against the windows. A blinding flash of lightning briefly illuminated my house, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that rattled everything inside. I quickly checked to make sure all of the windows were secured and glanced outside. The flow of water rushing across the glass almost completely obscured the view through most of my windows, but I could see fairly well for at least a dozen yards. The amount of water this storm was letting loose was unprecedented, and my first glimpse of the backyard through the pouring rain revealed rapidly growing rivulets of water running across it as it gently sloped towards the valley floor. The storm raged on for a few hours before calming to a moderate rainfall. It was late evening when I checked out through the window again. My backyard had been transformed from the morning's dry and desolate patch of earth to a veritable wetland, as the rivulets of water had coalesced into a shallow stream that stretched as far as my limited visibility allowed. Dried brush and debris rushed by, caught up by the flow of water, and I watched for a few moments, taking in the sheer amount of water that was now flooding the valley. In all my years of living in the desert, I had never seen a storm bring so much rain. Soon I noticed something else in the shallow, flowing water. There were small spots along the surface of the water in a handful of locations across the visible part of my yard. Less than a foot in diameter each, the water in these spots had started swirling around as if being pulled into a hole or subterranean passage, like water into a bathtub drain. In one of the small whirlpools closest to me, two spindly objects slowly rose from the swirling water. They elongated until they reached a height of 3 feet and stopped. They started twitching back and forth in the rain. Another pair of objects emerged, stretching upwards and growing before bending sharply downward to the surface of the water. Yet another pair followed right after, growing and bending down to join in probing the water beneath the first undulating pair. I realized what they were: antennae and legs. The two pairs of legs emerged fully from the water as a tan, shiny head, slick with water and sporting a savage set of jagged mandibles, was pulled from beneath the water. A long, segmented body covered with countless legs poured out behind it. All across the yard, legs began erupting from the swirling water, pulling more monstrous 3-foot-long centipede-like creatures from their desert burrows. Soon about a dozen of them scuttled about the yard on their long, articulated legs, antennae waving in the wind and jaws snapping with anticipation. There was a yelp from the front of the house, and I ran to another window to see. More creatures were emerging from the water in the front yard and across the street in the empty desert. 5 or 6 of them had found a coyote, and I watched, horrified, as a mass of segmented bodies and multitude of legs engulfed the crying animal. The creature's legs held down their prey as jaws tore into it, pulling away chunks that quickly disappeared into hungry mouths. It only took a few minutes for them to completely strip away and devour all the flesh. Then they started on the bones, powerful jaws crunching and snapping. When there was nothing left of the coyote, the creatures dispersed, clambering over desert brush and flipping over small rocks in the water, searching and hunting for their next meal. I saw one pluck a bird caught in the flowing water and devour it whole. Another climbed a small Joshua tree and pulled cicadas from the bark with its many legs. They were ravenous and efficient, leaving nothing unsearched or uneaten. Suddenly, one of the creatures hit the window, and I shrieked. The thing heard me and furiously bit at the window screen, cutting through it with its sharp mandibles as easily as scissors. It tore off pieces of the screen and started to scratch and bite vainly at the glass, the skittering of legs and clicking of jaws audible above the sound of the rain. I couldn't watch anymore and dropped the blinds. I turned away only to see another clawing at the window across the room. Tears streamed down my face as I ran through the house closing blinds, trying to shut the monstrous things from view. There was a thump at the front door followed by a frenzied scratching as legs scoured the surface. The unseen attacker found the edge of the door and started to try and work its claw-tipped legs through the small gap. There was a chewing noise as the jaws assisted in trying to burrow through the barrier, keeping it from its next meal. I knew if they somehow found their way into the house, there would be no escape, no hiding from them. I grabbed a hammer from the hall closet and desperately started smashing the claws creeping their way inside. The broken ends pulled themselves back through the door jamb and retreated. Breathing heavily, I backed away and sank to the floor in the center of the living room to keep watch. I sat there for hours, shaking and clutching the hammer to my chest with white knuckles. The sun went down and the storm continued. I didn't dare turn on any lights as I feared it would attract more attention from the monstrous things. As I sat in the darkness, all I could hear was the pattering of rain on the roof and the scratching of the creatures outside. The rain stopped around midnight. The scratching continued for a few hours before it too lessened and finally ceased. At dawn, I dared a peek outside through the blinds. In the morning light, I was able to look out across the desert. The water had drained away during the night and the sparse desert vegetation was flattened as far as the eye could see. I grabbed my hammer and cautiously crept out into the hot desert morning. A thick silence hung in the air. There were no bird calls, no insect noises. Nothing moved, and there wasn't even a breath of wind in the air. I edged my way across the yard towards the spot where the first creature had emerged. To my surprise, there wasn't even a hole left over from last night, no trace of those horrid things. I carefully tried to use the end of the hammer to dig around, looking for the hole. The ground was as solid as ever, with just a thin film of dust that had been loosened by the torrential downpour yesterday. The only evidence that the creatures had really been there was the lack of any wildlife whatsoever, and the faint scratch marks on my windows and doors. I plan to move before the next monsoon season. I can't live here knowing what dwells beneath the desert, waiting for the perfect storm to open a way to the surface. I don't know what those creatures were, and I never want to come across them again. All I know is, don't pray for rain in the desert. You don't know what the rain will bring. The parasite inside me got me pregnant. After I saw the offspring, I think I'm going to murder it. I still remember that black baby coming out of me, its bulging veiny body wiggling in my hands. And now I was stuck with this baby, all thanks to that thing that impregnated me. My husband was a safety hazard, and we could never be together for too long, as he had to return to his grave often. But when he cleared the misunderstanding, the damage was done. I was 5 months pregnant. Although I had never been pregnant before, I knew the pregnancy couldn't possibly be right. I had horrible urges. I woke up in the middle of the night, face down the earth of my garden, eating dirt nonchalantly. My doctor said it was normal to crave eating dirt because the body is begging for more nutrients. But even on 3 supplements, and all my blood tests perfectly fine, I was still eating it every night. Then once, I murdered a bird, crushing it inside my clenched fist, and immediately shoving the still warm little corpse in my mouth, feeling calm and relieved to listen to the crunching of the hollow tiny bones, rejoicing on the droplets of fresh blood running down my throat. For months I couldn't stop crying in disgust, but it didn't stop me from doing the same 3 more times. I'm afraid the baby is more like myself than like you, Jane. I know it will be hard for you, but everyone will be safer if I raise the kid. I didn't find it so hard to let go. My maternal hormones were nothing against the sight of the ugliest, most deformed baby I had ever seen, with a mouth completely full of little serrated teeth, which bit 2 nurses as soon as they reached their warm, living flesh, a misshapen giant head, and a crawling wet worm poking from her ear. Her father was there to hold my hand through the entire process, and immediately grab his spawn to take his leave. With his ability to slightly alter recent memories, he deleted our horrifying kid from the medical staff's mind. He named our daughter Camellia, his favorite grave flower. Camellia grew up in the cemetery, rarely leaving or interacting with humans, except the ones they hunted. Her father's favorite hobby was scaring and hurting horrible people in the middle of the night. He was nice for a man who was made of worms and crawling insects on the inside. I visited sometimes, but I mostly moved on with my life. If you get pregnant at only 19, people will show sympathy when you tell them that your daughter lives with her father, who can give her a better life. Camellia looked a lot like me, but, well, dead inside like Daddy. She loved showing me tricks such as opening a hole on her sclera and letting worms squeeze their way out. It was disgusting, but I gave my best to look excited to be around her. But I honestly felt uneasy at best. I couldn't believe I had given birth to such a creature. As Camellia grew into a teen, she became 2 things that made her even worse: moody and obsessed with me. "Can't you see her more often?" her father would ask. "She has me and others like us, but she really loves you." I found it very hard to believe that a girl who lashed out her worms to squirm all over people she doesn't like someone who cut her in line at the donut shop, or someone who parked where they shouldn't, was capable of love. At 13, she was already way more powerful than her father, so the only thing he could do was to alter the memories of her victims so they wouldn't be traumatized for life. Camellia threw tantrums, and we had to do everything her way, since she was stronger than us. I quickly grew to detest my own daughter for that. Then she started saying things like, "Mom should come live with us, I can turn you into one of us, and I can only be happy if I have you and Dad with me." I find it quite disturbing. "Is that true?" I asked her father. "I don't think so. I can't turn a person into one of us, so I doubt she can." "You worry too much, Jane. She's strong but not as powerful or evil as you think." She was stronger and more sinister than I thought. It was really bad timing, but by then I couldn't hide it from them anymore. I was pregnant again, and my fiancé would move in with me. Paul was a wonderful man, and I really wanted to have normal kids with him. To my surprise, Camellia was overjoyed to know that she would have a little brother and sister, at least at first. Then she started casually saying ominous things. "I'll get rid of the baby if I don't like them, though." The day I told her father I didn't want to see Camellia anymore because she was a danger to my family, she broke into my house in the middle of the night and tried to murder Paul. She was a ferocious beast when she got serious, and what she did to people who mildly inconvenienced her was child's play compared to it. If her father hadn't followed her and intervened, Paul would be dead. Instead, he's just scarred for life, both physically and mentally. Despite my husband being able to alter his memories, it wasn't enough to remove the whole trauma of literally starting to be dissolved alive. I couldn't allow Camellia to attempt again against Paul's life, or even worse, against our children. So I decided to murder my daughter. I needed a lot of research to find what I needed in the shadiest blog I've ever seen. The author referred to beings like Camellia and her daddy as worm people. The only way to murder worm people is by cutting them alive with an axe and burning the pieces as you go. To avoid regeneration, you have to destroy every single piece of them, or they will eventually grow back from even the smallest bit of rotten flesh, or from the smallest bug. Holy water helps by making the regeneration slower, but it won't hurt them otherwise. It was a horrible death to give your own daughter, but if she was willing to destroy everything I loved, it was the only way for me. I sent Paul to his brother's house and invited Camelia to watch a movie together. She thought that Daddy had erased my memory too, so she acted perfectly normally. I felt sick to be around her, but I gritted my teeth and waited until she fell asleep on the couch. I then tied her very cautiously not to wake her up. I knew that she could break free, but she'd waste precious seconds to do that. And then I proceeded to murder her bit by bit, repeating to myself the whole time, "She's a monster, not my daughter." Her warm and unnaturally black blood spilled on my face, making me both horrified with myself and relieved that she'd never hurt anyone again. I have memories of slashing and burning pieces of her as I aspersed her with holy water and she screamed. They are vague, but they are outstandingly real. I can still feel the gasoline burning my nostrils like a breath of fresh air against the sickening smell of decaying flesh on fire. So why did I wake up in a strange house in a strange city? Why Paul looks robotic and has no memories of our life being completely different, insisting that we've always lived here, and why is a worm poking from my ear? Something has been living in my daughter's closet. I should have done something sooner. I could never have known opening that door would ruin my whole life. I'm a mom of 2. Blair is 6 and Rosie is 3. After Rosie had her 3rd birthday, I decided it was finally time to go back to work, after taking time off to raise the kids. Time had gone very quickly, although I was finding it hard to get back into the swing of it at work. So, my husband and I agreed to do 2 opposite days a week in the office, 2 days at home, and then both in the office on a Friday while Rosie was to attend a local daycare. Everything was going smoothly. We had a good routine. Until one Friday afternoon, my husband Jim and I were working. Blair was at school and Rosie seemed to be enjoying her Friday daycare session. Then I received a phone call. But first, let me go back a little. We moved to this new neighborhood around 10 months ago. It was big but quiet, and the houses were a decent space apart with lots of yard space. This was very different from what we were living in before, but I really loved it there. Our house had 2 floors and a basement. The attic space was technically another floor, but we decided to just use it for storage. A few months after we moved in, we started noticing a few problems with the house. There were strange smells, which would seem to disappear by themselves. Things would go missing, then turn up in weird places, and food being taken from the fridge. I know what you're thinking. We have kids, these things happen with kids. But no, even having kids, these things were strange. My toothbrush, ceramic plates, and even the cleaning supplies which were safely locked away would disappear almost daily, then return back to another room a few days later. One time I awoke in the middle of the night to what I thought was my husband getting up to use the toilet. Although when my eyes adjusted, I saw him still laying next to me. This was strange, as I was sure someone was in the bathroom with the tap running, but after checking, no one was there and the light and tap were now off. I asked him about this in the morning, but he confirmed he hadn't gotten up at the time I suggested, so I just brushed it off. Strange things like this would happen frequently. Despite this, as I said, life was going smoothly until this Friday afternoon, when our lives started to turn upside down. The daycare was calling. I was at work in a meeting, but of course my kids are more important, so I answered the call. I was greeted with the voice of the daycare worker. "Hello, good afternoon, is this Zara, Rosie's mother?" "Hi, yes, this is her. Is everything all right?" Yes, no need to worry, Zara. Just a quick call to let you know that when you come to collect Rosie today, there will be an incident report to fill out." "Oh, all right. What's happened? Is she okay? Is everyone else?" "Sorry to scare you. Rosie is absolutely fine. Everything is okay. There was just something Rosie blurted out today. It's just nothing sinister or anything, just something she must have heard elsewhere. I won't repeat anything over the phone, but we'll let you know when you come to collect her. We just had to complete an incident report as it upset some of the older children." I could hear the panic in her voice. But my Rosie? This wasn't like her at all. She was so quiet. I picked Rosie up that day a little earlier than normal, and the daycare staff informed me she had mentioned something about a man living in her wardrobe who took her toys. I was gobsmacked. Where did this come from? I tried asking Rosie to explain to me what she was talking about, but she'd already forgotten. That evening, I informed my husband Jim about what Rosie had said. He was equally confused but seemed more scared. "You think this might have come from an experience?" he questioned. I hadn't thought about this before. God, maybe we fell victim to a burglary. I felt sick to my stomach. I initially thought this idea of a man in her wardrobe was something Blair had said, or something she'd seen on TV. But was there a possibility of this coming from an experience? Days turned into weeks, and with intense locking of doors, checking the house, and trying to talk to Rosie about this, we began to move on. 3-year-olds forget things quickly and can say strange things at times, is what we had convinced ourselves. Until one evening around winter break, Jim and I were sitting in the living room watching a movie. It was around 10:30 p.m., and the kids were both upstairs tucked into bed. It had been a long day, so Jim and I cuddled up and both began to drift off to sleep. Suddenly, I was knocked back into reality when footsteps were heard above us. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Jim. He mumbled back. "Must be Blair getting up for a pee." I waited. No, I thought to myself. It isn't Blair's room above us, it's our bedroom. I'm just going to check. I climbed the stairs, tiptoeing to not disturb anyone. But nothing. The kids were in bed, my room was untouched, and there was nothing unordinary. I choked it up to being sleep deprived and decided to call it a night. The following day was a Sunday, and since Christmas was only a few weeks away, we agreed it was a perfect day to set up the Christmas tree. Jim and I headed up the narrow staircase to the attic, and instantly were faced with an awful smell. It smelt like sewage, and was sort of musty. I worried a pipe may have burst, and that was what I heard last night. But after investigation, it was all fine. We dusted off the Christmas tree and brought it down the stairs, one person at each end. I was on the upper end, and while I descended down the stairs, I noticed something in the corner of the attic. "Hold on a moment, darling," I said, dropping my end of the box. Okay." Jim struggled and lowered his end. I approached the area, which was in an alcove of the attic with a ceiling height of about 4 feet. I hunched down. There were blankets, clothes, food wrappers, etc. "Holy!" I covered my mouth. "What's wrong?" Jim had managed to prop the tree up against the stairs and was now behind me. "Look," I exclaimed, feeling lost for words. My eyes began to water. "Previous owners?" I questioned. We looked at each other, agreeing. Something did feel off, but it was winter break. Family time was calling, so we cleaned it up and moved on to that instead. If only I had known. After completing the task of bringing the tree down the stairs, Jim and I went to collect the kids from their rooms to bring them down to help with the tree. Jim went for Blair and I was to get Rosie. We assembled in the living room, unpacking our Christmas memorabilia, dusting off the last 12 months. Christmas films were playing, we danced to music and ate chocolate. It was the best family night for a while. As the kids started to wind down and began to get sleepy, Jim set off to retrieve pajamas from the girls' bedrooms. "Please don't let the man in my wardrobe tonight get me." Rosie looked up at me with her big brown eyes. "What? What man?" My heart began to pound. This hadn't been mentioned for quite some time. I didn't think we'd hear about this again. "I will protect you, sweetheart," I reassured her. It's all I could do in this situation. Blair began to get upset hearing about this man in the wardrobe situation, which we had managed to hide from her all this time, so I decided to change the subject to settle her. Jim returned, clutching 2 pairs of purple matching pajamas. We headed upstairs after a snack, and I updated Jim on Rosie mentioning the thing again. "Must have been a dream she had," he stated, like he was reassuring himself. After tucking the girls into bed, I got halfway down the stairs when I heard a door opening upstairs. The girls had their own rooms, both in single beds so they could easily leave whenever they needed something, which they did a lot. I rolled my eyes, knowing this was only the start of the bedtime pandemonium. "Blair, Rosie, come on girls, it's bedtime," I called up, waiting for the reply of the child who left their room. No reply. I went to Blair's room first, but she was out cold, snoring away. I waited to see if she was faking. While standing in the doorway, something caught my eye. The attic door was left open. This was strange, as it's a child-proof door, and I'm sure I had closed it after taking down the decorations. I went over to close it, but as I did, there was a slight noise coming from Rosie's bedroom. Laughing, chatting, baby talk. There's the door opener culprit. Although as I pushed the door open, it suddenly stopped. "Rosie, I'm coming in." But it was empty. Confused, I stepped inside, checking under the bed, behind the curtains, but no sign of her. I went over to check the wardrobe. "Come on, come out, Rosie, are you in there?" I called out, getting annoyed now. "Yes, I'm in here, Mama." That wasn't Rosie. My blood ran cold as my expectation of hearing my daughter's voice was replaced by something unexpected. A man's voice, slightly high pitch. Unsure what to do, I shouted for Jim. "Hey babe, can you come here, please?" I felt my words begin to get muffled by tears. "Rosie's just come down here, Zara. She said she walked past you while you were in Blair's room. What's going on?" He replied. "I'm just coming up." Speechless, relief flooded over me, knowing Rosie was safe. Relief was quickly replaced by a rush of adrenaline when I realized, if Rosie is down there, then who is in the wardrobe? Shaking, I nervously swung the wardrobe door open to reveal a dirty old man standing amongst my daughter's sparkly pink dresses. I screamed so loud I think I ruptured my vocal cords. Before I knew it, Jim was grabbing my arm from behind and pulling me out of the room. Thankfully, he did this in time, as the man was lunging at me, holding one of our kitchen knives. The knife caught my forearm, leaving a mark, but I didn't feel the pain. We ran into Blair's room, scooping her out of bed. I heard the man climbing out of the wardrobe, knocking metal hangers out as he did. Jim and I loaded the kids in the car. The safest thing to do was just to leave. We sped off, driving for what felt like hours before returning to meet the police outside our house. An ambulance came to check me out, but all I needed was a new stitches. It could have been a lot worse. Cops found the man hunched in our basement laundry room, still clutching the bloody knife he used on me. They dragged him out in handcuffs, allowing me to get a better look. He was wearing my husband's clothes. His hair was matted and he was as thin as a stick. He looked ill and vacant, like he wasn't all there, or possibly on something. That day, while Jim and I were moving the Christmas tree, he managed to escape the attic while we were downstairs, not being heard due to the loud music. Rosie had left her bed that night due to being thirsty, and thank goodness she did, as I can only imagine what would have happened. Our missing items were found in his possession. And for 6 months he had been living above us, hiding amongst boxes, eating our food, using our facilities while we were away, stealing our things, and worst of all, watching us sleep. I feel we are lucky in a way as no one was seriously injured that night. I recovered well, and Jim and I were really shaken up to say the least. We moved out of that house 3 months later due to the horrific memories. We are safe now and have installed a security system and camera in our new house. If only I had listened to Rosie weeks ago. I searched my uncle's basement after he disappeared. I now know why he went missing. The last words I ever heard from him were, "Run." I never thought the day could be worse when I lost my Uncle Noah. We were very close, and I loved him. Whenever it looked like a fight was brewing, my Uncle Noah would sweep in and take me for a week or two while Hurricanes Jack and Twyla threw down. It spared me a lot of the stress most kids suffer in a broken home. I got to skip the fights and still come back for the reparations, such as an ice cream dinner and surprise game system that came from this fractured dynamic. And it wasn't until much later that I realized how unhealthy my family was. Uncle Noah was a collector. He had the usual obsessions like art and artifacts, but he had limited the scope of his interests to the occult, which made his collection especially intriguing to a child raised on tales from the crypt and Goosebumps. He had athames with intricate hilts displayed behind leaded glass, a deck of tarot cards locked in an airtight and bulletproof case, a crystal goblet nestled in a case of Bristol blue glass filled with argon, and countless books in piles on shelves and locked up in iron-banded chests. It was a mystical paradise. Every time I'd visit, he'd have a new piece for the collection and a story to go with it. "This is a portrait of Mother Shipton," he'd said of a painting he'd acquired when I was 10, a clairvoyant from the 16th century. It's the only known portrait of her to exist in the world. I'd recoiled from the exquisitely disfigured woman detailed on the canvas, but listened with rapt attention as he'd recounted what he knew of her life and prophecies. His house was filled with glass cases, locked shelves, and curio cabinets packed full of arcane objects, and the tales to go with them. The only case he never filled before his disappearance was the one he had reserved for what he called his white whale. "This is for the witness," he'd said, gazing into the brightly lit interior of a tall glass box. He built it in the middle of the library. I caught him staring at the case on many occasions, his eyes distant, as if imagining the piece he would one day display inside was already gazing back at him. "Because that was what the witness did," he'd said. "It watched the world as great events unfolded. Great, being vastly subjective and somewhat misleading from a human perspective. The witness," he'd said, "only seemed to appear when our plane intersected the path of something greater, which would briefly flicker into our experience just long enough to destroy everything in its way." The witness observed. My uncle knew not by what forces or why, only that it did, and that it appeared to do so from a fixed location. He believed if he could just gather enough data regarding the nature of the witness's intersections, he could reproduce the conditions and create a sort of window around it. And that was the box, his unfinished window. Unfortunately, it would remain just that, unfinished. He disappeared one cold, rainy night in November. It seemed he'd chased one too many fringe cults into the wilds, and much like Ahab before him, he vanished. In a mythical Roanoke-style mass exodus from a condemned church outside Merlin, Oregon, he had reportedly wandered into the forests and never returned. I never saw my uncle or his collection again. I spent a good deal of time making calls and pushing for the case to be reopened, but it went cold fast. After that, his estate went to his estranged wife. It would have been mine, my parents later informed me, had they not absolutely insisted he leave my name out of his will. As a result, piece by piece, his collection was dismantled and sold off to the highest bidders. All I had left of him was an old silver pendant he told me would keep us connected, no matter the distance, and a collection of non-occult books he'd gifted to me over time. At 10, I believed the pendant was as magical as anything else in his collection. At 20, it was harder to believe, but having it gave me comfort, especially once his estate was gone. I left home a short while later. I was off to college, and when that was done, I had an internship waiting for me in Portland. I didn't stick around to feel the effects of my parents and their slow descent into madness or divorce. I got birthday calls from them separately, and if I came home for Christmas, I spent more time with friends than family. My uncle had been the only family that mattered, and with him gone, it seemed like there was little point in pretending, a reality my parents never tried to contest. After college, when I had quiet moments to myself again, I thought of him. He was with me whenever I picked up a new book about the supernatural or stopped by an antique mall to browse. It was silly, but I always hoped maybe some piece of his collection would resurface. I knew nothing would. I knew everything had gone to private collectors like him, and that no collector in their right mind would part with anything they'd managed to get a hold of. But the act of looking, of feeling like the next stall over might have some familiar artifact of occult significance, helped fill the void he left behind. All it would take was an afternoon trailing my fingers over countless mixed antiques, the silver pendant warm beneath my other hand, and I could feel him with me again, his memory lingering in my mind like an oversized hug, and I'd give the silver pendant a little squeeze, like I was hugging him back. After that, I'd spend the rest of the day in a hazy afterglow of bittersweet nostalgia nestled in a bed of inner peace. I was caught in one such haze, curled up on the couch with a brand new book of paranormal essays my uncle would have loved, when I realized I was being watched. I don't know when it happened. I saw no movement, heard no sound. I just became aware of him crouching in the corner behind the old black ironwood stove in the corner, his head resting against the rough stone surround at an uncomfortable angle. And he watched me, with vacant, lidless eyes far too big for his pallid face. "Hey," I say, though I have no way of knowing. It looked humanoid in the vaguest possible sense. All his proportions were wrong. His head was too round, his torso too long. His fingers, which sprouted from a hand the size of a platter, curled delicately over one narrow shoulder, looking for all the world like the legs of an enormous sickly spider lazily basking in the light. He was too blunt and strangely angular to be much of anything that could be defined as human, but saying he, even to myself, was more comforting than either it, or somehow she. He sat opposite me, silent and unmoving. And thin, thinner than a man ought to be, with skin sallow and bleached. The waxen flesh stretched tight across his wiry frame was the color of missing teeth and old broken bones. Only the papery thin rattle of his own shallow breathing told me he was anything close to alive. He was just as my uncle had described him. The seconds ticked between us, counted by the old grandmother clock on the wall, and he did not move. Minutes came and went in silence. Then all at once he let out a tremendous wheeze, startling me as his whole body shuddered and drew inward as if he were on the verge of imploding. I waited, tense and horrified, for the wet crunch of snapping bone, but it never came. Instead, he slowly relaxed back into his former position, his eyes never straying from mine, nor mine from his. I was as frozen by curiosity as I was genuine terror. If this was my uncle's white whale, then I was in the greatest and most existential danger of my entire life. If it wasn't, then I had no clue what I was facing, and that was just as overwhelming to contemplate as whatever he might have been there to witness. Something about him struck me as familiar, though. Maybe it was because Uncle Noah had spent so much time regaling me with stories of the creature, filling my mind with so much information that I couldn't help but feel as if I knew him on a deeply personal level. I don't know. But whatever it was, in the hours we spent locked in each other's gaze, I felt a bizarre surge of unexpected affection for him. Something in his protruding eyes sparked it within me, and though my anxiety never diminished, I fought the urge to run into his spindly arms and never let go. And maybe I imagined it, maybe I wanted it to be true, so I dressed the memory up to suit my desires. But I thought for a moment his hand had shifted, as if resisting the urge to reach out to me too. Night descended and only the wan light of a table lamp continued to illuminate the two of us, throwing the jagged contours of his face into sinister relief. Some primal instinct screamed at me to flee, igniting my nerves as shadows crept outside my window, darkening the living room around us. The floorboard shifted behind me. For the first time since I'd noticed him, his gaze left mine, settling on a point somewhere behind my right shoulder. I lived alone, no pets, no lovers, no guests beyond the witness curled behind my stove. But we were not alone. In the thundering silence that followed, he finally spoke. My uncle never mentioned him speaking or even being capable of speech, and if he was at all capable, then it didn't sound like it was natural. His voice came out like a swollen window forced to open against its will, offering me just one word, just one warning: run. So I did. Something has been hiding in my walls for 7 years. What I found changed everything, and I'm lucky that I'm alive. I loved my grandfather, but now he is dead. He was my hero until I discovered his secret. Like most kids back then, we would spend time at our grandparents' house whenever our parents had to work overtime, or they just wanted to get rid of us for a weekend to spend time together. This was a weekend just like any other. Mom and Dad packed up our weekend clothes and our sidewalk chalk and dropped us off with Grandma and Grandpa. But pulling up to their house, me and my sister realized, almost simultaneously, that we had overlooked one thing. Grandma and Grandpa lived on a dirt road and had a gravel driveway, which meant there would be no art for us all weekend long. My sister and I loved art. Our grandparents did the best they could. They got out large papers and colored pencils for us to draw with, but it just wasn't the same. You know how kids hyper-focus on one thing and just can't let it go? That was me and my sister. Throughout the weekend they tried their best, but Grandpa could tell that it wasn't enough for us, and apologized quite a few times. I told him that it was fine and we still loved spending time with them. But just like Grandpa could tell that we were upset, I could tell that he was feeling like he had disappointed his grandchildren. Mom and Dad picked us up that Sunday evening, and we were back to sidewalk chalk art that Monday morning. Seeing as that Monday was the start of summer vacation, we had a solid 2 weeks of driveway murals, spending countless hours in the hot sun. Then on week 3, my parents decided to take me and my sister back to my grandparents for a weekend. And while I was excited, I wasn't super happy about not having my sidewalk chalk for another 2.5 days. But I loved my grandpa, and I was going to power through it. My parents packed up our bags again, and off we went. Through those back roads, onto that dirt road, and onto that gravel driveway. Except this time, there was a 4-foot by 8-foot wall made of solid concrete blocks, directly next to my grandfather's house. My parents looked back at me and my sister, wide-eyed in the back seat, and just said, "Your grandfather went to the city and asked if he needed a permit to build a wall on his property. Apparently anything under 4 feet is good to go." I opened up the car door and ran towards that wall. It was the greatest thing I had ever seen, and over the course of the next 7 or so years, we filled up that wall time and time again. As I said before, We get very little rain here, and instead of just washing away our artwork when it was full, Grandpa would just add more blocks. In our time, we probably made it a little over 3/4 of the way around his house, but getting very little rain doesn't mean we don't get any. There would be misting showers a couple times a year, but it never seemed to hurt our murals. I'm pretty sure Grandpa went out there and filled back in whatever went missing. That's just the kind of man he was. But here we are in 2022, and I just buried my favorite person in the world. My sister moved to New York, and I haven't heard anything from her ever since. And my parents refuse to leave the house still because of COVID. So it's up to me to go through my grandpa's belongings. He left the house to me, so I didn't mind the extra work. Seeing all these pictures and the fact the house hasn't changed a bit since I was 8 years old hit me hard. Do you ever just bury things? Unwanted feelings that just kind of sprout up? I drank about half a bottle of Jack last night and let the anger of losing him take over. I took a sledgehammer to that wall. I got through 3 blocks before I even noticed what was hiding inside of the walls. It was human body parts. I managed to contain my scream, but I was horrified at what I was witnessing. Each of the blocks held a different one. I found a hand and 2 feet. They couldn't be the same person either because they were 2 different colors. Then I destroyed the wall a little more and I noticed something far more gruesome. It was my sister's head. I couldn't imagine my grandfather ever being such a monster. He was my hero in my life. Now he is the villain. My buddy Eric saved my life. My buddy Eric is going to die tomorrow. He doesn't want to make it a big thing. I got some beer. Mike bought cigars. There are 5 fishing poles lined up in the back of my truck, 1 for each of us. The plan is to go down to the lake and see what the spot's got. One last time. This little story you're writing, he coughs, about tonight. Make it in the present tense, all right? Like I'm still here reading it with you, even if I'm not. I tell him that's fine. I'll figure it out later. And not too much about the disease, please. I think cancer has gotten enough conversation out of me. I tell him that's okay too. We drive. A cool breeze slices through the open window. Highway lights begin to fade. I turn right and stay straight on Fullerton Ave. I snag the roundabout next to the government offices. And then we're there. The old neighborhood, the place where we met, the place where we grew up. And now, the place where we'll say goodbye. We park. The houses on the block are all different, but there's still something so similar in the air. Almost like you can taste the feeling. Mrs. Walker's dinners, Tom's mom's cookies. Before we could drive. Before we could even ride bikes down to the corner store without permission from our parents. Everything was so much simpler back then. We always had someplace to go. The lake was home. Do you remember the bench? Eric asks. The big one. I did. I do. Somebody left it at the curb. Busted half to hell. You dragged that hunk of marble 2 miles just so we could sit in front of the water and fish. You could have helped. We made it, didn't we? We did. And look at us now. 30 years later. Still friends. We get out. The streetlights are all dimmed. Darkness paints shadows of abandoned toys in once familiar front yards. Eric corrals the tackle. I grab the drinks. My dad used to say beer should be heavy on the way in and light on the way out. He passed away some years back. I yearn for the past so damn bad, but I understand that it's truly gone. When are the boys coming? Eric asks. They should be here already. All of them? Yes. All right, are you all right? No. We walk. The path to the lake takes us out of the neighborhood and down into the valley. We march over a set of railroad tracks. On the other side is a steep rock hill. Eric huffs and puffs but takes the hurdle like a champ. We land on a soft embankment that leads right up to the lake. We smack the dust off our jeans. We look up. The guys are waiting for us. Hey! Mike rushes forward first. The big brute wraps our small friend in a bear hug. He's crying. He pulls back in embarrassment before grabbing a fishing pole. I'm honored to be here for you. Danny is next. He leans forward and whispers something meaningful in Eric's ear. The 2 of them share a silent stare. Dan backs off and disappears down the path. Thank you. Jeff is last. He looks around the group. He pauses. He sighs. I don't understand why you're not in a hospital. Dude, I'm just saying, you look fine to me. Do you have the best doctors? Are they sure this thing is fatal? How are you even walking right now? You can't just give up and croak. Modern medicine is incredible. Who's gonna pull your plug anyway? Eric nods through it all. He takes a deep breath. He waits for him to finish. Then he responds. I get it. You think I'm crazy. But the truth is that this is the end of my life. The doctors know it. The specialists know it. The specialists' damn attorneys know it. I know it. I could probably spend a few more weeks hooked up to machines, but he hesitates. What's the point, man? Really? If I'm going to die, then I want to die the same way I lived. With my friends, with my brothers. You guys, you don't understand. After my parents' accident, after my uncle moved away, you were all that I had left. You were my family. I slept on your couches, I ate your meals. We ran around the paths behind the lake for hours. I mean, screw blood. Our blood is here. On the ground where we spilled it. On chicken wire and hooks and pike teeth. He smiles. And, that's the other thing. We're not going fishing. The guys are surprised. I'm sorry I lied to you. I need your help one last time. A gentle rain peeks in between the trees. There's a legend about these woods. One that you might not have heard. A few hundred years ago, a soldier caught infection from a wound. His unit was ambushed and the remnants retreated down a trail into a valley. This valley. They were half slaughtered and left for dead. So the enemy moved along. There were other battles to be fought against living men. These guys, they knew they were screwed, you see. They didn't exactly have backup and each of them just took serious wounds in battle, so they were basically just waiting to die. One night near the end, the devil comes across the group. He sees 5 murderers, pillagers, gears of the war machine clinging for life. He fixes to have himself a feast. The doors of the underworld open up. All of Satan's minions pour out. The hounds get ready to eat. But the soldier is smart. He offers up a trade. He tells the devil that these are pure men. They murdered for mercy and for the country, but none have committed a crime in the eyes of God for which they hadn't repented. Hell could have none of them, or it could have one. Moved by the man's bravery and tempted by its taste, Satan agrees to the deal. 1 soul in exchange for the health and wealth of the remaining 4 friends. A clock is set for midnight. The group prepares their goodbyes. At which point, a plan takes shape. You see, the soldier knows a secret or two about these woods, a story older than angels and demons alike. The water here is sacred. The trees themselves are blessed. Eric produces a knife. He enters into a different sort of pact. Eric pierces his wrist. "What the hell, man?" Mike whimpers. "I did not sign up for witchcraft." Eric smiles and slams his hand against the tree. The sap turns thick and red. The sight of it dripping down the bark makes my stomach turn. He signs his spirit over to the lake. That way there is nothing left for Satan to take. He gives his body to the leaves. That way there's nothing for the demons to eat. He gives his blood to the trees. Eric carves something underneath. That way it remains there forever. We all stare at him. The soldier tells his friends to prepare a boat. Danny appears out of the distance. He's dragging something through the reeds. They are so weak at this point. It takes all the strength they have left just to lift this thing over the lake bed. The soldier gets inside. They hand him his rifle. He tells the group to save their farewells, for this is not the end, just a new beginning. The clock strikes midnight. A great wind gathers. A current takes shape. The soldier bids his friends to push him out to sea, so to speak, one final time. Darkness envelops the canoe inch by inch. A fog settles along the bank. Soon enough, he's gone. The devil readies his army. Hellions pour in from the coasts to feed on the poor man's soul. The meal is smaller than promised, but the meat is still appetizing. The group ducks and hides in the trees as horrible beasts with claws longer than limbs sneak through the woods and slither into the lake like snakes. The water grows restless with its new inhabitants. Waves of white froth back and forth. A whirlpool forms at the center. The boat is trapped in it, but so are the beasts. Demons and titans and the devil himself are caught up in the awful churning and chucking and turning. The lake opens up. Creatures cling to the edge. The wicked screams of furious spirits echo for miles. But it's no use. Mother Nature unhooks her jaw and swallows the poisonous lot whole. Eric smiles. Hell and all of its acolytes sink back to the underworld. He looks at me, and now it's gone quiet. The sky opens up. Buckets of rain pour forth and replenish the creeks and streams. Flames extinguish as fallen trees disappear underneath the breach. The soldiers stand up. One of them starts to laugh. Another begins to cry. Aching wounds are made mended. Cut legs are turned whole. The 4 run up the coast and shout with the unbridled joy of madmen given a second chance at life. Eric sighs. But amidst the celebration, the blue canoe drifts lazily back to shore. The group looks into the bottom and sees it's empty. The soldiers take this to mean that their friend is damned. He's paid the ultimate price. They pack up in a solemn silence. They start to leave. But on their way out of the valley, a funny thing happens. They pass by a tree. This tree. In the bark is written a message, a pact with the water, a promise to the leaves. The soldiers realize then that this death is a beautiful thing, a wondrous thing, a trick between 2 ancient powers, a choice to remain here in the valley forever, outside of the devil's reach. Eric gets into the canoe. The war ends. The 4 friends live long and full lives of incredible health, wealth, and prosperity, as promised. But as the years come to a close and death appears inevitable, they choose to form a new deal, a pact of their own. Eric pulls out a pistol, that no matter how they die, no matter when they die, they will all return to the lake, one last time, to join it. He loads 1 round. He looks at each of us. My skin is crawling. I'm not ready. "Now, do you know what I want you to do?" We do. "Okay, it's 12 o'clock. Mike is crying. Jeff is bargaining. Dan stops them. Because this isn't the end, and Eric doesn't want to make a big thing. We get into the water. We push off. We wave. I just want to grab him. I just want to pull him back. But he's gone before long. Darkness swallows the boat whole. An excited voice shouts out in the distance. Then he starts to scream. The lake begins to boil. It burns so quickly that the shoreline evaporates. Lightning cracks in the distance. The night is alive. Shadows race down from the hilltop and rip at the earth with hoofed feet. Their eyes are all rotted. Their teeth are like knives. They're on us. Razor claws tear up my sweatshirt. Blood bursts from the holes like a sprinkler. A rush of adrenaline hits and I want to fight. But I'm suddenly tired. I can't open my eyes. I can't hear. I don't want to die. Not yet. Not here. A single gunshot rings out. Then, as if somebody turned on the sink faucet, it started to rain. Water overtakes the bank and the lake fills up like a bathtub. The boat drifts back to shore and Jeff gets up to check. The rest of us don't need to see. We know it's empty. On the way out of the valley, we pass by a tree. Our tree. Carved into the wood are 5 names. Below them is a fresh one, and the writing is much easier to read. Eric was here. The contract is sealed now. Our bond is formed in blood. His journey is finished. Ours has just begun. Because one day, at the end of it all, each of us will row into hell alone. I pray the lake buries me and brings me back home.